So again, warm welcome to all of you to this 24 Flow release webinar, where we'll explain the highlights of our Spring 26 release. The agenda of today's webinar is as follows. I'm here together with Steffen. We'll do a release update and a demo. So first I'll present a little bit the features, and then Steffen will show a demo of some of these new features, and then I'll present the next section and so on. That will take roughly about half an hour. And then if you have questions, there is a chat box where you can enter your questions, but we'll take these questions at the end of the call and first do the presentation. Okay.
You have to press the allow this time.
Yeah, okay, let's get started. So today we'll cover three main topics. First one, shop floor efficiency. Well, we'll demonstrate some of the new components in our team cockpits that we've added as part of the spring release. Then we'll go to advanced planning logic. We have some new features in our resource scheduling, as well as in our Gantt charts that we're going to demo. And then finally, there are also some updates related to reporting, where we'll talk about QRM number. And we also have like a more system type of feature, which is the support for parallel routing. So really the goal is to go a little bit deeper than what we had in the release notes and to demonstrate those features also by means of practical examples. So let's get started with Team Cockpit. So I'm going to pretty quickly give you an overview of the new Team Cockpit components that we've added, but then Steffen will show them during a demo in somewhat more detail. The first component that we added was incident tracking. So the component kind of has two elements to it. First of all, there is an incident registration that can be part of the team cockpits, where operators can create new incidents and assign them to a particular team. And then on the right-hand side, what you see is a Kanban overview, which is typically being used by quality people or team leaders, where they really can track the status of particular incidents. So they can move from left to right, and such that you can track whether issues really get resolved. The second type of components that we added during the release are components that allow you to track certain measurements. So on the left-hand side, we have a component of a screenshot of a component in which you can track output, so quantity produced, as well as scrap and rework. And on the right-hand side, we have a component picker that allows you, as part of an operation or a production order, to track the number of components that were consumed during the execution of a particular operation. And obviously, you know, whenever you enter values here, these are also tracked on the production order itself for traceability purposes. The third thing that we'll demonstrate is POLCA. I'm not sure whether you're all familiar with POLCA, but POLCA is a whip control mechanism for high mix, low volume environments where you have flexible routing. Just to explain the basic principles, but Steffen will explain it later. You kind of assign to each operation a number of cards. So these are the number of cards that will be needed by the next team. So in this particular case, we have, so the gray is the selected operation. It goes from cutting to drilling, and we need 14 POLCA cards in order to be able to execute it. And here on the right-hand side, which is really the new component, the POLCA board, we're seeing that from cutting to drilling, there are 14 cards needed, but currently there are only 12 available. And that's why the blue claim button is grayed out here. So really the goal of POLCA is to do a kind of flow control and make sure that in a particular team cockpit, you only start working on production orders and operations for which there is downstream capacity available. But we'll demo that in somewhat more detail in the next few minutes. I'll skip this slide. Yeah. We have a second variant of POLCA in the product. So typically, if you implement POLCA in a physical context, you do it with cards that travel between workstations. We have a digital variant with the cards, but we also have a digital variant with time, where you express the available and the required capacity not as a number of cards, but you express it in, for example, minutes or hours or days, depending on your particular context. And then finally, the last component that we kind of changed during this release is the capability to optimize the performance of checklists by generating checklist results up front. Why could this be interesting? If you, for example, have a lot of checklists on the record page and you first load that record page, it may take some time before all the checklist results have been generated. If you generate these results up front and then you load the record page, the loading will go much faster, and that's done via flow. Okay, I'll hand it over to Steffen now to demo some of these concepts, and then we'll return to the slides when we head into the section of planning.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm just going to start off with the order structures so that you have a kind of idea what the different steps are that you are going to demonstrate. So our order is a basic order with an assembly step and a testing step. This will be shown throughout the demo. So I'm going back to my Team Cockpit overview. As you can see here, we introduced a POLCA board. So what Piet mentioned is that you can have like an overview of how many capacity is available between teams. So in this example, you see team assembly and team testing. The total amount of work is 120 minutes required from that team to the testing team, but there is only 60 available. We will show it in the Team Cockpit later that it will respond. On the other hand, you can also see that assembly has another team, a secondary testing team, which requires only 30 minutes, and you still have enough capacity available. Okay? So for the start, I'm going to start at the assembly station. What you can see here are various orders. One is going to testing 2, the other one is going to another testing team. So first of all, I'm going to demonstrate the component picker. So on the right-hand side, you see that when you click on the selection, you can have a component picker to give an operator the chance to register their components in detail. So when you click on the component, you can have a clear overview of the component that you need to pick, and you can enter the amount via a keyboard or via the buttons that are at the top. When the operator consumes the amount, you can see that the color becomes green because he matches the exact quantity one by one. It is also possible to add extra consumption, and in the backend, it's always all captured on the order level. As you can see now, it also turns red because you actually consumed more than was required for this component. So this is a kind of visual indication to whether you are doing the right thing or not. Also, the images are based on the product. So there's a product a lookup field to which image should be used. So different components have their own picture. As you can see on the right-hand side, now I have 120 minutes required. So each operation here takes 30 minutes of time from the testing team. So when you select, I will start this order, it's now in buffer, it will go to in process. You will see that the required minutes now is decreased by 90 because I started it, but the available minutes went from 60 minutes available to only 30 available. The idea behind it is when an operator claims, for example, the next order, which also goes to the same team, he gets 0 of the 60 available. So in this demo, it is not prohibited, but he should be guided that the next order you will start, do not take an order for testing team, but you should take an order for testing team 2, because there is still enough capacity available. So they decide based on the current situation which order they should start for the capacity of the next team, so that they are not overloaded. That's a bit the concept behind this. It's also possible to change the view so that you can see what other teams are looking at. So it's a kind of web control. It is easy to understand for operators. As mentioned by Piet, it's also possible to hide the claim buttons or to make them gray. But for the demo, they are all available. When you release an order, it will go to the testing team. I will now show the incident tracking capability. So here, when you are in the testing team, you can say, the order is in buffer or in a different status. I will log an incident. And the idea behind it is that you can report an incident back to the team that where it came from. So in this case, I will send it back to assembly, check component 1. So when you register the incident, it is linked to the specific order. But more important, when you go back to team assembly, it shows here on the right-hand side that there was an incident which was reported at another team. They have the capability to expand them, and then they can see what the other team said about the incident. And if the order needs to change back to the status of assembly, it's also possible, but then you get the loop for the incident tracking. As mentioned by Piet, this data is also captured in a Kanban view with statuses, so this is also linked to the team cockpit functionality of tracking the incident itself. So now we're back at the testing team. I'm just going to start an order. As you can see here, we added a button to create a checklist. It is not created up front, but in some cases you only want to create a checklist when a certain action is executed. So when for example, when an operator change occurs, a checklist needs to be created. So when you click on the action, the functionality triggers the checklist generation and makes the checklist ad hoc instead of upfront. That's a bit more functional explanation what this feature can do. We're just going to confirm it. I think that was all for the team cockpit side of it.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether you still want to say something about the output tracking.
Yeah, sorry. So like similar to the input tracking, we also have an output tracking component where you can also include the images. You can say I produced 5 items, and it's a similar functionality. You only need to produce 1, but I produced 5, so it's red. So it's a similar component to the consumption, but for production purposes. I think that's what's for the team. Okay,
thanks, Steffen. I'll take over the screen again, and we'll go back to the presentation. Okay, so now we come to the second part of the presentation where we'll talk about planning. So as part of our spring release, we have a number of planning improvements. First, I'll talk a little bit about general resource planning improvements. Last release, in the winter release, we introduced our Gantt charts, and the feature set of the Gantt chart has also been evolving here in the spring release, and I'll show you the highlights of that. And then if you do bottleneck scheduling with 24 flow, we use the concept of operation grouping. And within that concept of operation grouping, we introduced a new concept, operation runs, which I'll also briefly explain. So first on the general planning improvements, from our customer base, we got from quite a few customers the feedback that sometimes accidentally certain events were being moved in the planning board. In order to avoid that, you can kind of lock events now such that they, for example, not editable or read-only, or that you cannot drag them or resize them by accident. And Steffen will also show that as part of the demo. Then we have a second new feature, which is a little bit more technical and might be a little bit more difficult to understand, but Steffen will give a demo later on that hopefully will make it more tangible. It's a feature called transform flow integrations. And as you probably know, within 24 planning, we have the capability to create custom buttons, and that custom buttons can create or can execute in the background certain flows, certain actions. With the previous form of action flow that we had, the results were always saved to the database before getting back into the planning component. This transform flow works a little bit different in the sense that you can kind of make the changes only visible in the front end, and you can afterwards save them. And the demo that we'll show you is, for example, we create a custom button to highlight certain events with certain characteristics in your planning view, and then you can save that, but you're not obliged to do so. And it also those transform flow integrations can be used, for example, to group events, to reschedule them, and for example to reduce setup times for machines. But in those cases, you probably first want to simulate before you actually save and make that regrouped or reordered planning effective. Then we have our Gantt chart. Our Gantt chart, as I mentioned, we introduced it in the last release. So the idea of the Gantt chart is that it can be used for companies that work according to kind of on a project basis, where potentially production is only one step in the cycle. Here in the example, we have an engineering, a production, a transport, and an installation step. And the idea of the Gantt chart is that you can use it as a project management tool to manage the overall project. You can create a hierarchy of the task as you see it here. You can create dependencies between tasks, and you can create milestones. So I guess most of you are familiar with the concept of a Gantt chart. Now, what did we add in this release? First, we added some search functionalities, which you see here at the top, which makes it easier to kind of search for particular task or even resources that were assigned to particular tasks. And we also integrated the same concept of flow integrations as we have in the resource planning. So as you see here highlighted in green, I also have a custom button here available to execute certain actions. The other concept that we also borrowed from our resource scheduling is resource availability. So in this particular example, I had assigned Bobby Simons to the task mechanical work. Now, Bobby Simons is unavailable during a certain time frame, and that's what I see here in the pink bars. And then what happens is that the Gantt chart will automatically extend the duration of tasks taking into account the holiday of people. So there is a difference between the lead time, which is the time between the start and the end of the task, and the actual touch time or duration of the task itself. So the lead time will take into account the unavailability of the persons at certain moments. And then the last concept that will not demo, but I'll briefly try to introduce it here, is operation runs. The view we see here from our resource planning is you have certain operations, and the idea of operation runs is that if you have long-lasting operations, we can kind of split that operations into slots. So that's what you see here in gray. And the white blocks here are actually non-working time. So again, it makes it more visible when a certain operation is being worked on. And the concept of operation runs allows you also at the level of the slot, which could be, like in this case, for example, an hourly slot, to have capacity variations going from slot to slot. So we're not assuming anymore that you have the same capacity for the total lead time of the order, but we can really at a slot level determine the available capacity and the production outputs during a certain slot. The operation runs make something more visible and understandable of concepts that were already embedded as part of our operation grouping. And in particular context, this can be a very helpful addition. I'll hand over the word now again to Steffen to demo some of the new concepts in Gantt and in the resource planning.
Okay. So currently I am in 24 planning. As you can see, the assembly and the testing operations from a previous in-team cockpit are loaded. I can drag them. I can extend them. So yeah, it's basically adjustable like how much you want. With the new feature, when you go into the data source of the operation, in this case, I'm just going to go into it. When you disable the option that event is resizable, you will not be able to adjust the length of it. When you disable that it's not draggable, you will not be able even to move it at a different position in the plan board. So when I'm going to update it. When I now refresh my planning, I can see that they are stuck. I can try to drag them. It's not possible. Don't see the adjustment arrow anymore. When you enable the read-only value, these fields will not be editable anymore. So now I did it on a data source level. It's also possible to configure fields on the operation itself so that a specific event is not editable. For example, if you have like plant maintenance or something, and you have to execute it on that specific time, it can be locked in planning that other blocks cannot shuffle it around. So that's also possible on event level. The other feature that Piet mentioned, the transform flow, I'm going to give a practical example of coloring. So when here is a flow integration, when you press the color button, it's a simple screen where you can search for an operation, the subject of it. I just have assembly and testing. But when I search for assembly, you can see that the assembly lines are colored now. But more practical use cases are that you want to search for a specific product, that you can see where the different products are located. You search for a specific customer. These are also integrations that are possible within the new flow integration option. It's even possible to shift events to a different time and etc. So that was basically the normal planning functionality that was added. And I'm going to switch to the Gantt view. As you can see, it's going to reload and in my dataset. Okay, so now we are in the Gantt view. As you can see on the left-hand side, you can see different tasks and assigned resources. On the right-hand side, we see the actual tasks and their duration. We have similar functionalities as in the normal planning view, is that you can click on the event, specify your fields that you want to see the predecessors and the successors, the start date, also fully configurable. On the right-hand side, you can have the detailed filters. So for example, when I press search for project, I only get that task. When I search for resources, I can use the drop down. It's also possible to add multiple resources to one task. This is also now possible in normal planning, but mostly used in Gantt purposes. When you can see that the resource has non-working time. So when you drag an event on the non-working time, it is automatically extended. I'm now in a live update mode, so I have to press save in order to store the changes to the database. But as you can see, we have a full structure of the Gantt, which can be modeled in 24 Flow for production purposes. I think that was it for planning.
Okay, thanks, Stef. Let me share my screen again before we move to the last part of the presentation. Good. So there are two more concepts of the Spring release that I would like to introduce. One is the QRM number. So the basic idea here is that, in the previous release, we had introduced the concept of MCT, which is a QRM concept to measure lead time in production. Now, the question you may ask, well, we're doing a number of improvement actions within our company. How does our MCT evolve over time? Does our lead time get shorter? And one way to measure this is by means of the QRM number. So the QRM number is being defined as 100 times a base period MCT, which is like your initial MCT, for example, for a certain type of production order, divided by your current period MCT. So if your MCT gets shorter, if your lead time in production gets shorter, the QRM number will increase. So the idea is you have an upwards curve where at the base period, at the start, you start at 100, and as you evolve over time and get better and better performance and shorter lead times, the QRM number will go up. So really, this definition is something that comes straight from the quick response manufacturing methodology and handbook, but we now also added support for this in 24Flow. Not only for the QRM number, but also that we can store MCTs over time for a group of production orders. And Steffen will also briefly show this as a last demo. The last concept that I want to introduce is the parallel routing. We'll not demo it, but I'll explain to you the basic setup. So in most production setups, you have a kind of simple sequential routing where operation 2 starts after operation 1 has been finished, and so on up until the last operation end. We already supported this, and we also supported working with sub-assemblies where in order to build your main order, you first need to finalize or make some of the sub-orders. And those sub-orders or sub-assemblies could be produced in parallel as well. What we now introduced is something new, where also as part of your main order, you can have parallel operations. This could be here, these 3 parallel operation 2, 3, and 4 are somewhere in the middle of my set of operations, but they could as well be at the start or the end or in the other position. And so really, the idea here is that you're not restricted in modeling within 24Flow, but 24Flow has now an additional kind of natively embedded mechanism in which we can support parallel routing. Now, the way this parallel routing impacts 24Flow is a kind of threefold. So first of all, in general, in terms of how we model things within 24Flow, but then in the team cockpits, you will also see that there could be multiple predecessor or successor operations for a particular operation. And then obviously also within the planning, if you compute capacity, you need to take into account that some of these operations can be executed in parallel. Good. So I'll hand it over once more to Steffen to show you the last part of the demo, and then we'll see whether there are any questions.
Yep. So you probably saw it already on the first screen. At the top part of our overview page, we have the MCT graph, which is actually the mean of the current MCT of the default map in this case. So you would configure it as a product group. But if you want to watch the progress over time, you better look at the QRM number. So as you can see, we have a QRM number report, which basically states how much you are improving on your throughput time. So when an upwards graph means you're doing better than your reference date. In this case, this is the reference date, so it increases each snapshot that it takes. In the backend, we also calculate all this data. So when you look at the MCT calculations, you can see that every day or specified period, this is calculated, and you get the touch times for that specific snapshot or time frame. So, and it's also referred to, for example, this record, it uses that date as the baseline to start measuring. So you can measure your MCT in time. So you can monitor your performance and use this in reporting and other capabilities as well. Yeah, so that was basically the QRM number, shortly explained.
Okay, thanks, Steffen. I'm going to quickly open up the chat box here. I don't see any questions. Okay, I see somebody typing. While Arne is typing, I have a general question or comment. So this is the first time we organized a release webinar. We intend to kind of do it on a regular basis. If you have specific comments or questions or things we should do different or better next time, feel free to kind of send us an email afterwards, and we'll do our best to kind of take into account when we organize the next webinar. Could you maybe give a quick view on how we configure the parallel routing?
Arne, I don't have it set up in this demo, but maybe we can have a short call afterwards to explain the capabilities in your context, your company, if that's okay.
Yeah, okay. Any other questions or comments? No. If not, so I would like to thank you all for attending today's session. We took only about half an hour, but I hope it was informative and that you learned something more about our new product capabilities. Thank you and have a nice day.